At exactly 5:42 p.m., Julian Vance stood outside the presidential suite of the Grand Crescent Hotel, holding a crumpled note his best man had shoved into his palm, without a single word of explanation. The paper was still warm from Liam's hand, creased in strange angles as though he had been carrying it for hours, trying to decide whether to deliver it at all. Julian could picture the moment clearly. Liam standing in the corridor, torn between loyalty to his oldest friend and the sickening dread of what he knew. In the end, the truth had won. It always did, eventually. The note contained only 7 words, written in Liam's sharp, angular handwriting. He's upstairs. Room 1821. Don't ignore this. Julian read the words 3 times, each pass carving them deeper into his consciousness. His thumb traced the ink, smudging it slightly. His hands were trembling. He told himself it was the air conditioning. The hotel was always too cold. They had complained about it during every site visit, the wedding planner assuring them it would be adjusted for the event. The ballroom below glittered with crystal chandeliers that had cost more than most people's annual salaries. Ivory roses, 3,000 of them, cascaded from every surface, their sweet perfume drifting up the marble staircase. Nearly 400 guests waited in their expensive finery, champagne flutes in hand, for the wedding of Ethan Moretti, heir to one of the most powerful crime families on the East Coast, and Julian Vance, the Omega every society column insisted had finally tamed New York's most eligible alpha bachelor. Reporters clustered near the entrance like vultures, their cameras ready to capture the moment the city's most talked-about couple said, "I do." Society photographers adjusted their lenses, arguing about lighting and angles. Investors, judges, celebrities, and politicians filled the front rows, their presence a testament to the Moretti family's reach. Everything looked perfect. That was the problem. Julian had spent the last 3 years believing that perfect was something you earned through loyalty, patience, and unconditional love. He had supported Ethan through endless business dinners that stretched past midnight, family obligations that tested his patience, and public appearances where he was expected to smile and look beautiful while saying nothing of substance. He had smiled through lonely nights when work supposedly kept his alpha away, and ignored every whispered rumor about late-night meetings with mysterious companions, because trust was supposed to mean believing someone even when doubt knocked at the door. At 28, Julian had built his entire adult identity around the man he thought he would spend forever with. He had stepped back from his demanding career as executive assistant to one of Manhattan's most powerful CEOs, scaled back his own ambitions, and convinced himself that supporting his alpha's legacy was its own kind of fulfillment. He had told himself that love required sacrifice, and he had been willing to sacrifice everything. Now, walking down the quiet hallway with measured steps that belied the chaos inside him, he told himself there had to be an explanation. Ethan wasn't reckless enough to destroy everything on their wedding day. He knew what this day meant to Julian. An Omega from a modest background in upstate New York, without family connections or inherited wealth, who had clawed his way into the upper echelons of New York society through sheer competence and an unshakable belief that hard work would eventually be recognized. Ethan knew how many nights Julian had stayed awake helping organize every tiny detail of this wedding while balancing his responsibilities at the foundation. He knew how much Julian had sacrificed to build a future with him. The career opportunities turned down, the friendships that had faded from neglect, the dreams of his own that had been quietly shelved to make room for his alpha's ambitions. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, lined with identical doors and ornate sconces that cast warm golden light across the carpet. Julian's footsteps were silent on the plush fabric, but his heart was pounding so loudly he was certain the entire floor could hear it. His palms were slick with sweat. His scent, normally a calm, neutral Omega fragrance, had turned sharp with distress, the kind of pheromone release that any alpha within 50 feet would recognize immediately as fear. He reached room 1821. The door wasn't completely closed. Soft laughter drifted into the hallway. Familiar laughter. Ethan's. Julian's heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Sometimes heartbreak arrived so suddenly that the body protected itself by refusing to panic. Adrenaline flooded his system, and with it came a strange, crystalline clarity. His omega instincts, which had been screaming at him for months to pay attention, finally fell silent. They didn't need to warn him anymore. He already knew. He pushed the door open only an inch. Ethan stood near the window with Marcus Webb, a sleek beta model from one of the agencies Ethan's company frequently hired, draped comfortably against his shoulder. Julian recognized the diamond cufflinks he had helped Ethan choose last Christmas, platinum settings with sapphire accents, custom-made, costing $18,000. Only they had never been intended for him. Julian had wondered why Ethan had insisted on selecting them alone, claiming it was a surprise. The surprise, it turned out, was that they were for someone else entirely. Marcus smiled as Ethan brushed a loose strand of hair away from his face with a tenderness Julian hadn't felt in months. The gesture was intimate, familiar, the kind of casual affection that only comes from repeated practice. Julian watched Marcus's lips curve upward, watched the way his beta scent, something floral and unthreatening, mingled with Ethan's alpha musk. Then Ethan laughed quietly, that low chuckle Julian had once found so charming. Julian will never know. He's so predictable. He mistakes kindness for love. Marcus kissed his cheek with practiced ease. What happens after the ceremony? Ethan shrugged without hesitation, the motion casual and dismissive. The wedding secures my father's approval. The marriage secures the board's confidence. After that, he paused, a cruel smile playing at his lips. I'll handle the annulment. Everything has its timing. Julian didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't storm into the room demanding answers. Didn't confront the two men who had just shattered every illusion he had clung to for 3 years. Instead, he stepped backward so quietly neither of them noticed he had ever been there. His feet moved on instinct, carrying him away from the door, away from the laughter, away from the future that had just crumbled to ash in his hands. Somewhere downstairs, a string quartet began rehearsing the processional music. The familiar strains of Pachelbel's canon drifted up through the floor, notes that had once seemed so romantic now sounding hollow and mocking. Guests applauded as another limousine arrived outside, the sound of celebration filtering through the walls like a cruel joke. Julian looked down at the engagement ring on his finger, a 3-carat diamond that had cost more than his mother's house. It sparkled under the hallway lights, catching reflections from the chandeliers, beautiful and meaningless. Less than 24 hours earlier, Ethan had promised forever while looking directly into his eyes, his alpha voice rich with sincerity that Julian now recognized as performance. Now forever had become a business strategy. He slipped the ring off his finger and closed it tightly inside his palm until the edges pressed against his skin hard enough to leave marks. The pain was grounding, a small anchor in the chaos of his thoughts. The elevator chimed at the far end of the hallway. Its polished doors opened with effortless silence, revealing a figure that made Julian's breath catch in his throat. A tall man in a perfectly tailored black suit stepped out, flanked by 2 discreet security professionals who immediately slowed when he raised a single hand. The gesture was minimal, almost lazy, yet it commanded absolute obedience. The security men melted back into the elevator, their presence becoming invisible. Dante Moretti, Ethan's father, the most feared alpha in the northeastern underworld. The man who had built an empire from nothing, whose name was whispered in boardrooms and back alleys with equal parts respect and terror. He had arrived earlier than anyone expected. His silver hair framed a calm face carved by decades of impossible decisions, decisions that had made him enemies, yes, but also millions of dollars and the kind of loyalty that money couldn't buy. His sharp gray eyes, the color of winter storms, settled on Julian before he could hide the truth written across his expression. Dante's gaze was penetrating, the kind of look that saw straight through every carefully constructed facade. Julian had always felt exposed around him, as though the older alpha could read his thoughts with a single glance. Now that feeling was magnified tenfold. He noticed the untouched boutonniere lying on the hallway table, a perfect white rose that Julian had selected himself, that the florist had delivered that morning with a smile and a congratulations. He noticed the ring clenched inside Julian's trembling hand, the diamond winking in the light. Most of all, he noticed the quiet dignity of an Omega trying desperately not to fall apart in front of anyone. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, charged with something Julian couldn't quite name. He had never been alone with Dante before. He had never had a reason to be. Their interactions had always been polite, formal, conducted at family dinners or public events where propriety demanded distance. Now there was no distance. There was no buffer of social convention. There was only the truth, standing between them like an uninvited guest. Dante's nostrils flared almost imperceptibly, scenting the distress pouring off Julian in waves. His expression flickered, a flash of something that might have been concern or anger or both. Then he walked toward Julian with measured confidence, each step deliberate and controlled. He glanced once toward the half-open hotel room behind Julian, his gray eyes sharpening with understanding. He returned his gaze to Julian's face, and when he spoke, his voice was so calm it almost sounded like fate itself. If my son was foolish enough to lose an Omega like you, perhaps it's time someone else gave you the future you deserve. Julian stared at Dante Moretti as though the hallway itself had shifted beneath his feet. Of all the things he had imagined hearing on what was supposed to be his wedding day, those words had never crossed his mind. They were absurd, impossible, the kind of suggestion that belonged in fever dreams or romance novels, not in the cold reality of a hotel corridor. Dante did not sound impulsive. He did not sound amused. He sounded like a man who had already considered every consequence before speaking, a man who never made decisions lightly. Julian's Omega instincts, which had been in a state of chaotic alarm since reading Liam's note, suddenly focused with laser intensity on the alpha standing before him. Dante's scent filled his senses, dark cedar and something dangerous, like smoke from a distant fire, with undertones of authority and power that made Julian's knees feel weak. It was a scent that commanded attention, that demanded response. More importantly, it was a scent that held no deception. Julian finally found his voice. "You cannot possibly mean that." Dante's expression remained calm, but something flickered in those gray eyes. Warmth, perhaps, or respect. "I never say anything I do not mean." Julian looked toward the half-open suite behind him, where Ethan still believed his carefully arranged future remained untouched, where his fiancée's laughter still echoed in Julian's memory. Then he looked back at the man standing before him. Dante Moretti was 54 years old, devastatingly handsome in a way that time had only sharpened. His silver hair was immaculately styled, his jaw strong and unyielding, his body still powerful beneath the expensive cut of his suit. He had presence, the kind of commanding energy that made rooms fall silent when he entered, that made people instinctively want to please him. His reputation filled newspapers, boardrooms, and whispered conversations across New York. People described Dante as disciplined, brilliant, impossible to manipulate, and completely devoted to protecting the legacy of his family. He had buried rivals, outmaneuvered competitors, and built an empire that spanned legitimate business and darker enterprises with equal skill. Yet standing only a few feet away, Julian saw something the headlines never mentioned. There was disappointment in those gray eyes. Not directed at Julian, but at the son he had raised. A deep, bone-weary disappointment that spoke of years of watching someone make the wrong choices, of hoping for better and being let down again and again. "I'm sorry you had to discover the truth this way," Dante said quietly. "No Omega deserves to begin a marriage by learning they were only part of someone's strategy." The words hit Julian like a physical blow. Strategy. That's what he was to Ethan. A means to an end. A piece in a larger game. All those years of devotion, all those nights spent waiting for his alpha to come home, All those sacrifices, they had been nothing but currency in Ethan's calculations. Julian lowered his eyes toward the engagement ring still resting in his closed hand. The diamond pressed into his palm, sharp and unforgiving. I believed every promise he made. That says more about your character than his. Those words nearly broke the composure Julian had fought so hard to keep. His eyes burned with unshed tears, but he refused to let them fall. He had cried for Ethan before, alone, in the dark, when his alpha had forgotten another anniversary or canceled another dinner at the last minute. He was done crying. No one had defended him all afternoon. No one had asked whether he was all right. Everyone downstairs was celebrating an event that no longer existed, toasting champagne to a future that had been a lie, while the only person willing to acknowledge his pain was the father of the man who had caused it. Julian took a slow breath, steadying himself. If you came to convince me to forgive him, you're wasting your time. Dante shook his head once. Forgiveness is earned. It cannot be requested on someone else's behalf. A silence settled between them. The sounds of the orchestra drifted faintly through the ceiling while guests continued arriving below, unaware that the future they expected had already collapsed. Julian could hear the distant murmur of conversation, the clink of glasses, the occasional burst of laughter. All of it sounded impossibly far away, as though it belonged to another world entirely. Dante glanced briefly toward the ballroom level before returning his attention to Julian. In less than 30 minutes, every influential person connected to my family will be seated downstairs. Investors, judges, community leaders. They all came because they believe the Moretti name represents honor. Julian looked at him carefully. And now your son has embarrassed that name. No, Dante answered. My son embarrassed himself. The family name will survive. Character is harder to rebuild. Julian studied him, searching for hidden motives. He had spent years working alongside executives, negotiating contracts, reading people for a living. He knew how easily powerful people disguise transactions as kindness. His Omega instincts were finely tuned to deception, honed by years of navigating a world that often dismissed his kind as weak or emotional. Dante's scent remained steady. There was no spike of guilt, no surge of triumph, no hint of manipulation. Just calm, steady alpha presence, the kind that didn't need to prove anything because it already knew its worth. Why are you helping me? Julian asked softly. Dante did not answer immediately. Instead, he folded his hands behind his back and looked through the hotel window overlooking Manhattan. The sky was beginning to darken, the city lights flickering to life like scattered diamonds. His profile was striking against the glass, all sharp angles and composed stillness. Several months ago, Ethan missed an important charity meeting because he claimed he was ill. You attended in his place. No cameras were following you. No reporters were taking notes. Yet after the meeting ended, you stayed another 2 hours helping an elderly volunteer organize donated supplies because everyone else had already gone home. Julian blinked in surprise. He had never told Ethan about that afternoon because it had not seemed important. It was just something he had done, the way he always did things, quietly, without expectation of recognition. You knew? I happened to arrive as you were carrying boxes to her car. Dante's voice was soft, almost contemplative. I watched you work for nearly an hour. Not because I was spying, but because I couldn't look away. You never once checked your watch. Never complained. Never asked for help. You simply saw something that needed doing and did it. Julian frowned. Why did you never say anything? Dante smiled faintly. Because kindness that expects applause is negotiation. Yours was genuine. Julian felt his heartbeat slow for the first time since opening that hotel room door. The frantic pounding that had driven him down the hallway, the panic that had filled his chest, it was quieting, replaced by something steadier. Something that felt almost like hope. You've misunderstood me, he whispered. I'm not extraordinary. Exactly, Dante replied. You never believed you were. That is what makes you extraordinary. Before Julian could respond, footsteps echoed from the far end of the hallway. Ethan's voice called confidently from inside the bridal suite, completely unaware that the future he had planned was already beginning to disappear. "Julian? Where are you?" The photographer wants the pre-ceremony shots. There was no concern in his tone, only impatience. He sounded like someone looking for an appointment that had started running late, an inconvenience to be managed. Julian's chest tightened at the casual dismissal. Dante noticed the sound as well, but his expression did not change. "We have less than 5 minutes before he reaches this hallway," he said calmly. "You have a choice to make. And whatever you decide, no one will force your hand." Julian looked at him with disbelief. "You're asking me to marry a man I barely know." Dante answered without hesitation. "No, I'm asking you to refuse becoming a victim in someone else's carefully written ending." The words settled heavily in the silence between them. For the first time that afternoon, Julian was no longer thinking about revenge. He was thinking about dignity. About the version of himself who had walked into this hotel, believing love meant overlooking every unanswered question. He had spent 3 years adjusting his schedule around Ethan's career, supporting his ambitions, accepting lonely evenings, missed anniversaries, and vague explanations because he believed commitment required sacrifice. Looking back, he realized he had been the only one sacrificing. Ethan's career had flourished while Julian's had stagnated. Ethan's name had grown more powerful while Julian's had faded from professional relevance. Ethan's wealth had increased while Julian's savings had been depleted by the endless demands of planning a wedding that was never going to happen. Dante reached inside the pocket of his tailored jacket and removed a slim, ivory business envelope. He handed it to Julian without ceremony. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No legal language. No financial conditions. No list of obligations. Only one sentence had been typed across the center of the page. "I will never ask you to become less than who you already are." Julian read the sentence twice before lifting his eyes. His fingers trembled slightly as they held the paper. "This is not a contract." "No," Dante replied. "Contracts protect assets. Promises protect people." Julian could not remember the last time anyone had spoken to him with such quiet certainty. Ethan had always filled every conversation with plans, numbers, timelines, acquisitions, and expectations. He had never simply listened. He had never simply been present. Dante spoke only when he had something worth saying. His words were measured, deliberate, chosen with care. Julian folded the paper carefully and returned it to the envelope. His movements were slow, giving himself time to think. "If I agreed, everyone would think I accepted because of your name." Dante nodded once. "Some will. They'll call me ambitious. Some already do." His gray eyes held Julian's gaze. "Whenever an Omega succeeds, they'll think you wanted revenge." Julian looked directly into his eyes. "Only you have to know why you made your decision." The hallway became quiet again. Downstairs, the wedding coordinator announced that guests should begin taking their seats. Soft applause floated upward through the marble staircase. Time continued moving even while Julian's world had stopped. He suddenly remembered his mother telling him years earlier that the hardest decisions were never between right and wrong. They were between familiar pain and unfamiliar hope. His mother had been a beta, a schoolteacher in a small town where Omegas were rarely taken seriously. She had raised Julian alone after his father abandoned them, had worked 2 jobs to put him through college, had never once complained about the sacrifices she made. She had always told him that being an Omega was not a limitation, it was a gift, that his instincts were not weaknesses but strengths, that his capacity for empathy and connection was something to be proud of, not something to hide. Julian wished she had lived to see this day. He wished she could have been there to witness the moment he finally understood what she had been trying to teach him all along. "Julian." Ethan's voice echoed again, closer now, tinged with irritation. "Where the hell are you? We're on a schedule." There was no concern in his tone, no worry, just the frustration of someone whose carefully orchestrated plans were being disrupted. Julian closed his fingers around the engagement ring one final time before walking to a nearby decorative table. Without anger, without tears, he placed the ring gently beside a vase of white lilies. It landed with a quiet metallic sound that somehow felt louder than the orchestra below. He turned back toward Dante. If I walk away today, I lose everything I spent 3 years building. Dante slowly shook his head. No. You lose the illusion. Those are not the same thing. Julian released a long breath he had been holding since opening the hotel room door. The fear was still there. The fear of starting over, of being alone, of facing the world's judgment as the Omega who got left at the altar. But something stronger had begun growing beside it. Self-respect. He looked straight at the man standing before him and spoke with steady conviction. I will not spend another minute begging someone to choose me. Dante gave the smallest nod of approval. There was something in his eyes that looked almost like pride. Before either of them could speak again, Ethan appeared at the far end of the hallway with an easy smile that disappeared the instant he saw his father standing beside Julian. Ethan stopped so abruptly that even the confidence he wore like an expensive suit seemed to disappear for a moment. His alpha scent spiked with confusion, then alarm. His eyes moved from Julian to his father and back again, searching for an explanation that made sense. "Dad?" he asked with a nervous laugh. "What's going on? I thought you weren't arriving until the ceremony." Dante remained composed. "That depends on whether you're asking as my son or as the man who just destroyed his own future." Ethan frowned. "I have no idea what you're talking about." He laughed again, but the sound was hollow. "Julian, are you feeling okay? You look pale." Julian watched him carefully. Just minutes earlier, he would have believed that expression of concern. He would have let Ethan's charm smooth over the cracks, would have convinced himself that everything was fine. Now he recognized it for what it truly was, practice. Years of polished excuses hidden behind effortless charm. Ethan stepped closer to Julian and reached toward his hand. "Everyone is waiting downstairs. We shouldn't be standing in the hallway. The photographer is going to have a fit." Julian quietly stepped back before he could touch him. The movement was small, but it said everything words no longer needed to explain. Confusion crossed Ethan's face, quickly replaced by something sharper. "Julian." Julian looked at him steadily. "You should go back to Marcus. He's probably wondering where you disappeared to." The color drained from Ethan's face. For the first time since Julian had known him, he looked genuinely surprised. His alpha scent curdled with fear, the sharp tang of panic cutting through his usual composed musk. "You followed me?" "No," Julian answered calmly. "I trusted you. That was enough." Ethan quickly recovered, lowering his voice as though this misunderstanding could still be managed. His hand reached out again, placating. "Whatever you think you saw, let me explain. It's not what it looks like." Dante interrupted before Julian could respond. "There are some things that explanation only makes worse." Ethan turned sharply toward his father. "This has nothing to do with you. Stay out of it." Dante's gray eyes remained steady. "The moment your choices threatened an innocent person, they became my concern." Ethan laughed uneasily, the sound high and brittle. "This is ridiculous. Julian, we've invested 3 years into this relationship. Don't throw everything away because of one misunderstanding. You're overwrought. The wedding stress is getting to you." Julian almost smiled. Not because his words were comforting, but because he finally understood how differently they defined love. To Julian, love had been honesty, vulnerability, the willingness to give everything to someone else. To Ethan, love had apparently been negotiation, a transaction where both parties got something they wanted. He reached into his pocket and removed the handwritten vows he had planned to read during the ceremony. The edges were slightly bent from being carried all morning, the ink smudged in places where he had rewritten words he couldn't get right. He had spent weeks on those vows, trying to capture the depth of his feelings in words that would do them justice. He looked at them for a long moment before placing them gently beside the engagement ring on the hallway table. "Those promises were written for a man who never existed," he said softly. Ethan's composure cracked. His alpha scent spiked with desperation, the pheromones flooding the corridor. "Don't do this in front of my father. Don't humiliate me." Julian met his eyes without anger. "You already did that yourself." Silence settled over the hallway. Even the music from below seemed distant now, muffled by the tension that filled the space. Julian could feel Dante's presence beside him, steady and unwavering, a rock in the storm of his emotions. Ethan looked toward Dante, expecting support, expecting authority to restore order the way it always had throughout his life. His father had always fixed things for him, always smoothed over the consequences of his actions, always made sure the Moretti name remained untarnished. Instead, Dante calmly adjusted the cuff of his jacket before speaking. The ceremony downstairs will not take place. Ethan stared at him. You can't cancel my wedding. You don't have the authority. There is no wedding left to cancel. The guests are here. The media is here. Everyone is waiting. Then they will learn the truth. Ethan lowered his voice urgently, stepping closer to his father. Think about the headlines. Think about the family. Think about what this will do to the business. Dante answered without hesitation. For once, I am thinking about the right person. Julian felt something inside him finally become still. The fear that had followed him through the hotel had quietly dissolved. The anxiety that had been gnawing at him for months, the constant question of whether he was good enough, whether he deserved Ethan's love, it was gone. He was no longer trying to save a relationship that had already ended long before today. He was choosing himself. Dante turned toward him. Mr. Vance, I asked you a question a few minutes ago. I'll ask it only once more. Ethan immediately stepped forward. What question? What did he ask you? Dante never looked away from Julian. Will you allow me the privilege of building a future based on respect instead of deception? Ethan's eyes widened as the meaning of those words finally reached him. He looked back and forth between his father and his fiancée in complete disbelief before whispering the only sentence he could manage. You cannot be serious. This is insane. Both of you have lost your minds. Julian did not answer immediately. He looked at Ethan, at the man he had loved, at the alpha who had promised him forever and meant nothing. He looked at Dante, at the man who had offered him dignity when he had nothing else left. And finally, he looked toward the grand staircase where guests continued taking their seats, completely unaware that the carefully planned celebration below had already become part of the past. He understood that whatever he chose in the next few seconds would change every chapter of his life. He also understood that fear had guided enough of his decisions already. Ethan finally found his voice again. Dad, this has gone far enough. Tell him this is some kind of joke. Tell him you didn't mean it. Dante remained perfectly still. I have never joked about another person's dignity. Ethan turned desperately toward Julian. You cannot actually be considering this. We belong together. We've been together for 3 years. Everyone knows we belong together. Julian studied his face, searching for the alpha he had fallen in love with. Instead, he saw someone worried about appearances, headlines, and losing control. Not once had he apologized. Not once had he admitted the truth. Not once had he asked how deeply he had hurt Julian. Everything was still about him. That realization made Julian's decision unexpectedly simple. He looked at Dante. If I say yes, I need you to understand something. Go on, Dante replied. I will never pretend to be someone I'm not. I will not become a decoration standing beside a powerful man. I have my own career, my own opinions, my own values. If those things ever become a problem, I will walk away. A faint smile appeared on Dante's face, the first genuine smile Julian had seen from him all afternoon. It transformed his features, softening the harsh lines of command into something warmer, almost gentle. Those are exactly the reasons I asked. Julian took one slow breath before extending his hand toward him. Then my answer is yes. Ethan stared at them in complete disbelief. His alpha scent was a chaotic mess of fear, anger, and humiliation. Julian, have you lost your mind? He's my father. He's old enough to be your father. This is... Julian gently shook his head. No, Ethan. I finally found it. Before he could respond, Dante offered his arm with quiet courtesy instead of urgency. The gesture was old-fashioned, almost courtly, and it made Julian's heart ache with its simple respect. Julian accepted it without hesitation. There was no dramatic gesture, no celebration. only two people choosing to walk forward instead of backward. Together, they made their way toward the marble staircase. As they descended, conversations inside the ballroom slowly faded one table at a time. Hundreds of faces turned toward the entrance, expecting to see the bride and groom. Instead, they saw Julian walking beside Dante Moretti. Confusion spread across the room almost instantly. The musicians stopped playing in the middle of a note, the final chord hanging in the air like a question. Camera flashes filled the air, reporters exchanging uncertain glances. Members of the Moretti family rose from their seats, unsure whether they were witnessing a misunderstanding or history. Julian could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on him. He could hear the whispers spreading like wildfire. What's happening? Who is that? Where is Ethan? Why is Dante with the Omega? His hand tightened on Dante's arm, and Dante's free hand covered his briefly, a subtle gesture of reassurance. Julian felt the warmth of the older alpha's touch, the solid strength of him, and something in his chest loosened. Dante calmly escorted Julian to the front of the ballroom before addressing every guest with the same composed authority that had earned respect throughout decades of leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. Unfortunately, the ceremony you expected will not take place. A wave of whispers rolled across the room. Dante waited patiently for silence to return, his presence commanding attention without effort. Marriage deserves honesty, respect, and commitment. Without those values, a ceremony becomes nothing more than decoration. My family will never celebrate appearances over integrity. Julian stood beside him with remarkable composure. Only hours earlier, he had arrived believing he would become someone's husband. Now he stood before the same audience, refusing to become someone's excuse. Dante looked toward him briefly before continuing. There will be a different announcement in due time. Until then, I ask that you respect Mr. Vance's privacy and recognize the courage it takes to choose self-respect over comfort. Across the ballroom, Ethan remained frozen near the entrance while every eye slowly shifted toward him. For the first time in his life, charm offered no escape. Influence bought no sympathy. Confidence could not rewrite the truth. Julian quietly realized that the most powerful victory was not making someone else feel small. It was refusing to let them decide how much he was worth. The ballroom slowly emptied, but the silence it left behind seemed louder than the conversations that had filled it only minutes before. Guests departed carrying unanswered questions, while reporters rushed outside, hoping to be the first to understand what had truly happened inside the Grand Crescent Hotel. Julian stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, as the evening sun reflected against rows of glass buildings. His wedding day had disappeared, yet he did not feel broken. He felt strangely free. Dante approached carrying 2 cups of coffee from the quiet lounge adjoining the ballroom. He handed one to Julian without saying a word. Julian accepted it with a grateful smile. "Thank you," he said softly. "You remembered I never drink champagne." Dante nodded. "I noticed during every company event Ethan invited you to. While everyone celebrated with expensive bottles, you always chose coffee. You'd sit in the corner, nursing your cup, watching everyone else with that careful expression you have, like you were cataloging everything, filing it away for later." Julian looked at him with quiet curiosity. "You noticed that too?" "I notice people who remain themselves when everyone else is trying to impress a room." Dante's voice was low, intimate. "I've been watching you for longer than you know, Julian." They stood together for several moments watching the city below. Neither of them seemed uncomfortable with the silence. Julian realized how unusual that felt. Around Ethan, silence had always meant something was wrong, a fight brewing, a complaint waiting to be voiced. Around Dante, silence simply meant there was nothing dishonest filling the space. "Earlier, you said you had seen me before," Julian said. "More than once." Dante looked out the window before answering. 3 years ago, your mother became seriously ill. She needed treatment that insurance refused to cover completely. Julian slowly turned toward him. He had never shared that chapter of his life with anyone outside his closest friends. It was too painful, too raw. His mother's illness had nearly destroyed him, had consumed every resource he had, and then some. How could you possibly know that? Dante smiled faintly. Because the charitable foundation that approved the emergency grant belonged to my family. Julian's eyes widened. That anonymous donation was authorized from your office. He stared at Dante, struggling to process what he had just heard. The grant had appeared out of nowhere, a miracle that had allowed his mother to receive the treatment that bought her another 2 years of life. He had always wondered who was behind it, had always wanted to thank them, but the foundation refused to reveal the donor's identity. Why would you help someone you did not even know? Dante answered without hesitation. Because your application letter never asked for sympathy. You only asked for one more chance to help your mother recover. Most people write about what they deserve. You wrote about the person you loved. Julian remembered every word of that letter. He had written it after midnight at a hospital waiting room, convinced no one important would ever read it. He had described his mother's kindness, her resilience, her unwavering support of his dreams. He had not begged. He had simply told the truth. You never told me. Helping someone loses its meaning if gratitude becomes the price. Julian lowered his eyes, overwhelmed not by the money but by the quiet kindness behind it. His throat tightened with emotion. My mother. She never knew who helped her. She always wanted to thank them. She knew someone cared. That was enough. After that, Dante continued, I occasionally asked about your family. I wanted to make sure you were all right. Then Ethan introduced you to us almost a year later. I believed he had found someone worthy of building a life with. I was happier for him than he ever realized. Julian could hear genuine disappointment beneath Dante's calm voice. He was not speaking as a businessman or the head of a powerful family. He was speaking as a father who wished his son had become a better man. You expected more from him, Julian whispered. Every parent does. Dante's voice was heavy. I watched him grow up, watched him make mistake after mistake, and always believed he would eventually learn. But some lessons can't be taught. They have to be lived. Before Julian could respond, Dante reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully unfolded the same ivory paper Julian had seen upstairs. I have no intention of asking you for an answer tonight, he said. You've already survived enough for one day. But my offer remains exactly the same tomorrow as it does now. No pressure. No deadlines. No conditions. Julian looked at the single sentence typed across the page once more. I will never ask you to become less than who you already are. For the first time in many years, he believed those words were not a promise designed to win his heart. They were a promise designed to protect it. At that very moment, across the hotel lobby, Ethan watched through the glass doors as his father and the Omega he had taken for granted stood side by side in peaceful conversation. And for the first time, he realized he had not merely lost a fiancé. He had lost the only person who had ever truly believed in him. 3 weeks later, the Moretti family headquarters overlooked Midtown Manhattan with the quiet confidence of a company that had survived generations of economic storms. Julian stepped out of the elevator carrying a leather portfolio instead of flowers, wearing a tailored navy suit instead of a wedding tuxedo. He had accepted Dante's invitation to help modernize the charitable foundation and oversee several executive initiatives while taking time to consider the future they had discussed. The foundation had always been Dante's pet project, a way to channel the family's wealth into something meaningful. But it had grown stagnant over the years, bogged down by bureaucracy and outdated practices. Julian saw potential where others saw problems. Nothing about his position had been handed to him. Every proposal he presented was challenged. Every report was reviewed. Every decision had to be earned. That was exactly the environment he wanted. Respect built through ability lasted far longer than admiration built through appearances. As he entered the executive conference room, conversations paused for only a second before continuing. Some directors welcomed him warmly. Others remained cautious, still unsure whether the recent headlines had made him an opportunity or a controversy. Julian ignored both reactions and focused on the presentation waiting on the screen. He had spent the previous week preparing a complete restructuring plan for the Foundation's scholarship program, creating a system that would increase transparency while expanding assistance to small communities often overlooked by larger organizations. His research had been meticulous. He had interviewed program directors, reviewed decades of applications, analyzed the demographics of recipients and non-recipients. The gaps in the system were glaring once you knew where to look. When he finished speaking, the room became unexpectedly quiet. Dante looked around the table. Questions? One director slowly raised his hand. Only one. Why did we not implement this years ago? Several people smiled in agreement. Julian allowed himself a small breath of relief. His work had spoken before anyone discussed his personal life. The meeting ended with unanimous approval. As executives gathered their documents, Ethan entered without knocking. His expensive suit and confident posture suggested he expected the room to revolve around him just as it always had. Instead, no one stood. No one interrupted their conversations. The attention he once commanded had quietly shifted. Ethan looked directly at Julian. "May I speak with you?" Julian answered politely. "If it concerns foundation business, we can schedule a meeting." "It does not." Julian closed his portfolio. "Then I don't think there is anything left to discuss." Ethan glanced toward Dante, hoping for support. "Dad, are you really comfortable pretending this situation is normal?" Dante remained seated. "I'm comfortable respecting the choices of two capable adults." Ethan exhaled sharply. "He's turning everyone against me. The board is looking at me differently. The staff won't make eye contact. I've lost my standing." Julian met his eyes with calm honesty. "No, Ethan. People are responding to your own decisions. The truth came out. About Marcus, about your plans for the marriage, about everything. You did that to yourself." Ethan took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I made a mistake. People make mistakes every day." "Yes," Julian replied. "They do. The difference is that responsible people admit them before they lose everything. Not afterward. You had 3 years to change, Ethan. 3 years to become the alpha you pretended to be. You chose not to." The room fell silent again. Several executives quietly exchanged glances. Not because Julian had embarrassed Ethan, but because he had spoken without anger. There was no bitterness in his voice. Only clarity. Ethan looked at Dante one final time. "Are you really going to let him replace me? I'm your son. Your blood." Dante folded his hands on the conference table. "No one can replace another person. But leadership is not inherited forever. It is maintained through character. You've had every opportunity to prove yourself, Ethan. You've squandered them all." Ethan's shoulders slowly dropped as the meaning settled over him. For years, he had assumed his future was guaranteed because of his last name. Now he understood that the family legacy his father protected had never been about power alone. It had always been about responsibility. As Ethan quietly left the conference room, Julian gathered his papers and turned toward the window overlooking the city. Dante approached beside him with a quiet smile. "You handled that better than I would have at your age." Julian looked out at the endless skyline stretching toward the horizon. "I finally realized something." "What's that?" Dante asked. Julian smiled with peaceful confidence. "The greatest revenge is becoming the person heartbreak tried to convince you that you could never become." Dante's hand came to rest gently on the small of Julian's back. The touch was light, barely there, but it sent warmth spreading through Julian's entire body. He leaned into it without thinking, his omega instincts responding to the alpha's steady presence. "The foundation needs a director," Dante said quietly. "Not a figurehead. Someone who will actually make a difference. I've been looking for the right person for years." Julian turned to face him, their bodies closer than they had ever been. "Are you offering me the position?" "I'm offering you the opportunity to prove you deserve it." Dante's gray eyes held his gaze. "The same way I would offer it to anyone. No shortcuts. No special treatment. But I have no doubt you'll succeed." Julian felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, hope, something deeper that he wasn't ready to name. "I won't let you down. I know." Dante's hand moved from Julian's back to his shoulder, squeezing gently. "You never have." Autumn arrived quietly in New York, painting the trees surrounding the Moretti estate with shades of gold and crimson. Nearly 3 months had passed since the day Julian walked away from the life he thought he wanted, and every morning since then had taught him the difference between being admired and being valued. He no longer measured his worth by someone else's promises. He measured it by the peace he felt when he looked in the mirror. The charitable foundation had expanded beyond expectations. Scholarships reached hundreds of students. Community clinics received new funding. Local newspapers praised the foundation's transparency. But Julian always redirected the credit toward the entire team. Dante noticed that habit every single time. Success had never changed Julian. It had only revealed who he had always been. One evening, after a long board meeting, Dante invited Julian to walk through the estate's gardens before heading home. The air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, and the stone pathways glowed beneath warm lanterns. Neither of them hurried. For the first time in years, Dante realized he enjoyed ending his day with conversation instead of silence. "You've transformed more than the foundation," he said. "The staff respects you. The board trusts you. Even the ones who were skeptical at first have come around." Julian smiled gently. "I only built on what was already there. You created the foundation. You provided the resources. I just made things work better." Dante shook his head. "That is exactly what true leaders say. They never take credit. They never claim the spotlight. They just keep building." They reached a quiet gazebo overlooking a small lake where the water reflected the evening sky. Dante rested one hand on the wooden railing before speaking again. "There is something I should have told you long ago." Julian turned toward him, sensing an unusual hesitation in the man who always seemed certain. Dante's scent had changed, still steady, but with an undertone of vulnerability that Julian had never detected before. "I'm listening." Dante drew a slow breath. "The day Ethan introduced you to our family, I was relieved. I believed he had finally found someone whose kindness would help him become a better man. I hoped he would learn from you." Julian lowered his eyes. "He made his own choices." "He did," Dante agreed. "And when he continued making the wrong ones, I told myself it was not my place to interfere with your relationship." He paused briefly before continuing. "That remains one of my greatest regrets." Julian looked at him with quiet compassion. "You're not responsible for another adult's decisions." Dante smiled sadly. "No, but I was responsible for remaining silent when I first suspected he no longer appreciated the extraordinary Omega standing beside him." The words settled gently between them. There was no pressure hidden inside them. No expectation. Only honesty. Dante continued in the same calm voice that had first reached Julian in the hotel hallway months earlier. "When I asked you to consider a future with me, it was never because I wanted to punish my son. Revenge fades quickly. Respect does not. I admired your strength long before that wedding day. I admired the way you cared for your mother without asking for recognition. I admired the way you treated every employee with the same kindness you offered executives. And somewhere along the way, admiration quietly became something much deeper." Julian felt tears gather in his eyes, not from sadness, but from hearing words that carried no manipulation, no urgency, and no conditions. Dante's confession was simple, honest, and utterly unlike anything Ethan had ever said to him. Dante looked directly at him. "Whether you choose to spend your future with me or not, nothing I have said changes. You deserve a life where you never have to question whether you are cherished." Julian smiled through glistening eyes. "Do you know what surprises me the most?" Dante gently shook his head. "I spent years believing love was proven by grand promises, by expensive gifts, by dramatic declarations. Then you taught me that true love is revealed in quiet consistency, in noticing the small things, in showing up without being asked." Julian reached for Dante's hand with calm confidence. "I've never had anyone see me the way you do." Dante's fingers intertwined with Julian's, his grip warm and steady. "I've spent decades building an empire, but I've never built anything that mattered as much as this." As they stood together beneath the autumn sky, neither of them realized that someone watching from the edge of the estate finally understood a painful truth. Ethan had never lost Julian because his father had taken him away. He had lost him the day he stopped seeing the remarkable Omega who had been standing beside him all along. 1 year later, the Grand Crescent Hotel welcomed another celebration beneath the same crystal chandeliers that had once witnessed the end of Julian's old life. This time, there were no whispers of uncertainty, no carefully crafted appearances waiting to collapse, no promises built upon convenience. The atmosphere felt lighter because every person gathered inside understood that the occasion they had come to witness had been earned through honesty rather than expectation. Julian stood near the entrance, not because he was nervous, but because he wanted a quiet moment to remember the Omega who had walked into this building believing he needed someone else's approval to feel complete. He smiled softly as he realized that Omega no longer existed. He had been replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and finally at peace. The past year had been a journey of discovery. He had rebuilt his career, strengthened his friendships, and learned to trust his own instincts again. He had also fallen deeply in love with a man who had shown him what true partnership looked like. Dante approached wearing the same calm confidence that had always defined him. Yet there was something different in his expression now. The distance he had once placed between himself and his emotions had disappeared. He no longer protected only his family name. He protected the people he loved. "Are you ready?" he asked gently. Julian nodded with a warm smile. "More than I have ever been." Together, they entered the ballroom as family, friends, foundation volunteers, employees, and community leaders welcomed them with heartfelt applause. No reporters had been invited. No publicity campaign had been organized. The day belonged only to the people who had shared their journey. During the ceremony, Dante made only one promise. "I cannot erase your past, but I will spend every tomorrow making sure you never doubt your worth again. You are not a strategy, Julian. You are not a transaction. You are the only future that matters to me." Julian looked into his eyes before answering. "You never rescued me from heartbreak. You simply reminded me that I was always strong enough to walk through it. I just needed someone to believe in me while I found my way." There were quiet tears throughout the room, not because of sadness, but because everyone recognized the rare beauty of two people choosing respect before romance and trust before celebration. Months later, the Moretti Foundation opened a new education center dedicated to Julian's late mother, honoring the Omega whose kindness had inspired her son to keep believing in compassion even after disappointment. Children filled the classrooms with laughter. Volunteers welcomed families through open doors. The building stood as proof that painful endings could become meaningful beginnings. Ethan attended the opening from a respectful distance after receiving a personal invitation from Julian. Life had humbled him in ways success never could. He had accepted a leadership position in one of the Foundation's outreach programs, determined to rebuild his character through service instead of status. He no longer expected forgiveness as a reward. He simply hoped to become someone worthy of offering kindness without expecting anything in return. Julian greeted him with quiet courtesy. "Thank you for coming, Ethan. It means a lot to see you here." Ethan's eyes were red-rimmed, his sense subdued. "I owe you so many apologies. I don't even know where to begin." "Start by being honest with yourself," Julian said gently. "The rest will follow." Dante shook his son's hand with calm acceptance. "There's still time to become the man I always believed you could be. It won't be easy, but nothing worth doing ever is." Healing had not erased the past. It had transformed what the future could become. As the sun slowly set behind the Manhattan skyline, Julian stood beside Dante watching children race across the courtyard with hopeful smiles. He slipped his hand into Dante's, and Dante gently returned the gesture. Neither of them spoke for several peaceful moments because some endings did not require grand speeches. They only required grateful hearts. Julian finally looked toward the city where his life had once fallen apart and whispered, "The greatest gift was never finding someone powerful enough to change my future. It was finding someone wise enough to remind me that my value had never depended on being chosen by the wrong person." Dante smiled quietly as evening settled around them. "You were always remarkable, Julian." I just had the privilege of being the one to tell you." Together, they walked toward the families waiting inside, leaving behind the chapter that began with betrayal and embracing the life that had been built through respect, courage, forgiveness, and love strong enough to turn heartbreak into home.